Welcome to the first in a series of videos that are going to take you through the process of identifying and recording old pottery, broken ceramics that you might find if you're part of a community archaeology project, or when digging the garden, walking a ploughed field, in an old dump or animal burrow. Wherever ground has been disturbed, you're quite likely to find pottery. These videos have been produced for the Small Pits, Big Ideas project. And this was a National Lottery Heritage funded investigation of the medieval origins of settlements in Worcestershire. It dug test pits, mini excavations 1 metre square, across 6 villages in the county. My name's Rob Hedge, and I'm an archaeologist. One of my roles is analysing pottery, and I've been working on recording and analysing some of the many thousands of fragments from the Small Pits excavations. Our aim is to give you the knowledge and resources you need to do the basics, to tell your Roman tankards from your flower pot, your willow pattern from your medieval whitewares, and to give you the skills you need to start describing and interpreting your finds. First of all, why pottery? Well, pottery has been made and used in Britain and Ireland for the last 6,000 years. That record's not continuous everywhere, as we'll discuss, but it's one of the few materials to show up consistently in the archaeological record throughout that time. And that's partly because it's a material that generally survives pretty well. Unlike many of the things we've used to make objects over the last 6,000 years, wood, wool, cloth, bark, plant fibres, it's really durable. And it's really common. People are clumsy. We've always been clumsy. Pots are fragile. Pretty much all of us at some point in our lives would have dropped a plate or a mug and flinched as it smashed to smithereens. If you imagine that multiplied by all the people who've lived in Britain and Ireland over the last 6,000 years, that's a lot. And it's only really in the last 100 years that waste collection and disposal services have systematically removed waste from a community and taken it to a dedicated disposal site. Before that, waste tended to be dealt with within the community, buried, heaped, burned, reused as aggregate or fertiliser. And as we go through, we'll talk about the how and why of where pottery ends up. But this means that it's a really useful marker of how long people have been living in an area, and how the size, shape and density of that settlement has changed over time. What is pottery, first of all? We're talking about objects that are made of clay. A variety of other materials can be added to the mixture, but the primary component has to be clay, and then fired using heat. The key quality of clay is that it's plastic, which when used as an adjective like that means it's a material that can be moulded into a shape and retain that shape. But once fired, transformed through the application of intense heat, the clay becomes hard and loses its plasticity. Its shape is fixed, it's become ceramic. There are lots of other types of ceramic artifact produced in this way that are not pots, bricks, tiles, kilns, ovens, and the boundaries get a bit blurred when talking about some classes of artifact. Generally speaking, pottery refers to ceramic objects, either domestic or industrial, typically functioning as vessels or containers. Now, a bit on terminology. A fragment of a broken pot is called a sherd, S-H-E-R-D. The core is the middle of the vessel wall. Here we go. The margins are the bits just below the surface. So here's the interior and exterior margin. These are the exterior and interior surfaces. And the two key terms that will come up through these videos are fabric and form. Fabric refers to the composition of the clay. There are two aspects to this: the raw clay itself, which may contain all sorts of inclusions, such as small fragments of stone or shell. Clay varies in its purity. For very fine pots like porcelain, pure white primary clays like the china clay you find around St Austell in Cornwall are preferred. They're formed by weathering of igneous rocks into tiny particles, just 4 micrometers across. But most pottery has historically been made from secondary clays, moved around by rivers or glaciers. They pick up all sorts of impurities along the way. Along with the naturally occurring inclusions, potters frequently add other things into the mix for a variety of reasons. A lower proportion of clay can help to prevent shrinkage and cracking during firing, for example. Inclusions that are added deliberately are called temper. Before the late 18th century, most potters sourced the clay they needed locally. So each production centre is, in theory, identifiable through the mineral composition of the raw clays. In practice, it can be tricky. It's not always easy to tell which components occurred naturally and which were added deliberately. And potters varied their mixture over time and for different types of vessels. What this means is that one production centre might have produced multiple different fabrics, or sometimes that multiple producers using similar clays are grouped under one fabric. Form refers to the shape of the vessel. Most commonly, you might have a jar or a bowl or a jug or a mug like this one. But forms can be complex and are rarely immediately obvious. Candlesticks, chamber pots, dripping dishes, lamps, distillation units, colanders, bird feeders, you name it. At some point, someone will have made it out of clay. But these more unusual forms are less likely to be found, partly because they're less often broken. You'll also hear archaeologists and collectors use the term ware. This tends to be a grouping of similar types of vessels produced in a particular area in the same period, but it can be very broad. Severn Valley ware, this stuff, refers to a Roman tradition lasting from the mid-1st to the 4th centuries CE, including pots made along the Severn from Gloucestershire up through Worcestershire and beyond. Now, if you're out and about, you do have to be aware of the laws and ethics around collecting ceramics. The laws differ slightly between the nations of Britain and Ireland. In England and Wales, material found on the land belongs to the landowner, unless you have prior agreement. Few landowners are likely to begrudge you picking up the occasional interesting 19th century sherd in your local park, but please don't go hauling out heaps of stuff without permission. Another thing you need to be aware of is whether a site is scheduled. In England, for example, there are 20,000 scheduled ancient monuments protected by law and managed by Historic England. Wales has over 4,000 under the stewardship of Cadw. You must not remove artefacts from these areas. Sometimes they're obvious, the site of an old castle or monastery with earthworks or bits of walls sticking up all over the place. But if it's a Roman villa or deserted medieval village, there might be nothing above ground to see, and they won't necessarily be marked. You can check online, and I'll share some useful links at the end of this video. If you suspect you found something particularly old or unusual, I'd encourage you to report it. For England and Wales, the Portable Antiquities Scheme is your first port of call. Their archaeologists are specialists in recording artefacts found by the public, and all of your records go into a database which forms a powerful research tool. If you have concerns about a site, you think you might have an archaeological site at risk from erosion, for example, contact your local Historic Environment Record Office, who will also be able to tell you about any other relevant finds from the area. Now, how do you identify pottery? First of all, how do you tell if it's made of clay? This is surprisingly difficult, and I still get material sent to me by professional archaeologists that turns out to be stone. Many sedimentary rocks like mudstone resemble clay because that's basically what they are, just compressed and hardened over millions of years. One good indicator is feel. Stone will typically feel cool to the touch, whereas pottery generally feels warm. Now this depends slightly on the conditions you're doing this in. And if you're peeling off your gloves having spotted something in a ploughed winter field, everything is likely to feel cold. So what else? Look for some evidence of form. Is it an even thickness? Stand it on a flat surface. Can you see curvature? Are there any signs of decoration? Parallel lines or grooves from its construction? Or are the surfaces a different colour or texture to the broken edge? Around here in the West Midlands, where many pots contain grains of quartz, chunks of sandstone can look very similar to pot. But if you look at the broken edge, with a sandstone you'll typically see the break is filled with a mosaic of little grains, small but visible. Remember that clay particles in pottery are not visible to the naked eye. So with pottery, you'll always have areas in that break where you can't see individual grains. Now, before you can identify it, you'll need to get it cleaned up. Most of the material that you will find is pretty robust, but before you scrub it, take a moment to do a couple of checks. Is it covered with soot or other residues from its use? Bright green specks from using copper alloy casting, or limescale-like deposits on the inside that might be food residues? Set these aside if in doubt. For the rest, wash in warm water, no detergent. Use an old toothbrush. Fancy ridged ones are very handy for getting the mud out of nooks and crannies, but be mindful. If the pot is crumbling or is so soft that you risk scrubbing away the surface, go gently. If you suspect you might have prehistoric pottery, and we'll cover what this looks like in another video, that is often very fragile and may not survive dunking and scrubbing. Gentle dabbing with a small sponge or cotton bud might be okay, but if in doubt, just leave it and get it to a specialist. If the pot is very muddy or covered with sticky, clay-rich soil, you might find it useful to have a washing up bowl full of warm water to soak the sherds for a few minutes and remove the worst of the muck, and then a second bowl for final cleaning and rinsing. Lay them to dry in a seed tray on a bed of newspaper. If you've got different sherds from different areas, make sure the label stays with the pot. I always add a note to the paper as well in case the bag or label blows away. Give it a generous amount of time to dry, because moisture can lurk deep inside older, more porous fabrics, even when surfaces might appear dry, and then get them bagged and labelled. In the next video, I'll show you the basics of analysis, how to identify and describe your finds. I hope to see you there. But first, the links I promised. Coming up are some useful resources for finding out whether a site is protected and for reporting finds through the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Thanks for watching.